All right, so before we start diving deep, let's take a look at the big picture of how you would start altering your golf swing to take advantage of the side that's been causing you so much trouble and speed up the learning process and start adding some power to your swing. So what is it really, again, that most golfers struggle with? It's this right side dominant stuff, doing things the wrong way at the wrong time with the right side of the body. For most golfers, it really stems from tension in this right shoulder and this right arm. Most golfers, the average golfer, casts the club, they start coming over the top, and this is, again, all right side dominant stuff that's used incorrectly. Now, you still can't do that stuff no matter what you do. You can't push the shaft with your right arm. You can't cast the club, you can't throw the club away and all those things. You have to have your swing sequenced correctly. But by leveraging the right side of the body to get the right arm to get in the right position, then you can start to think about adding some right arm speed in there as you feel like you want to do so. But the bigger thing first is understanding kind of like this three-stage rocket is how I kept thinking about it in my head. If you're going to use the right side and you're going to be dominant with that right side to a degree, you have to get the sequencing of this thing right. And it's easy to do. It's very easy to do. I'm going to make it really simple for you to understand. But I want you to think about it in terms of a three-stage rocket. Stage one of the rocket is still always your hips, just like we talked about in the dead drill. The only thing that's going to be different is we're going to use a lot more right side hip drive. Now this is important because as you start understanding what's going to happen with the arms and the swing, and I'm going to show you what happens in a left side dominated release versus a right side push release, you're going to see the need that the hips really have to do a lot of work. The right hip especially has to do a lot of work initially to avoid flipping or creating a steep angle of attack. So stage one, right hip. Stage two, right shoulder. And this is also very important. Again, if we're going to add some right hand in the bottom, which you don't even have to with this, this is an optional thing and it's really going to be more for stronger players. But I'm going to talk about how if you're a female who isn't very strong and doesn't have very strong arms or wrists, how you don't need to use your right arm at all, but you do need to use the first two stages of this rocket undoubtedly. Right hip, right shoulder. The last stage of the right rocket is then this pushing or thrusting motion. And I hate the description of pushing because it makes you start to want to think like really shoving this club down. It's going to steepen your angle of attack or cause you to get your divot too far ahead. It's not like that at all. But there's no better way that I can think of how to describe it because it does look like more of a pushing motion. And we're going to look at some Tour Pros swings at the end of this video that are going to walk you through what that looks like in some really, really great ball strikers movements. But let's first understand how this three-stage rocket goes together when you're going to be lead side dominant and how that differs from when you're going to be trail side dominant versus lead side dominant. The lead side dominant side of the thing, obviously, we're going to make a big turn because we need a lot of body rotation and load up a lot of big muscles so that our arms don't have to do much, which is still going to be similar to what we're going to do. It's just not going to be using the right arm. And we shift and we turn our hips, but not a lot of right side drive. We shouldn't need that in a lead side dominated swing. We're going to use our left legs, our left side of our body, our hips, left side of our body to pull the club through and let it release nice and easy. My hips get to chill out a little bit more, especially the right hip, in that movement pattern. However, when we start wanting to be able to add some right side into this and avoid the club flipping over or digging down steep divots, then the movement pattern needs to change a bit. So instead, now we're going to, still the same thing, shifting over to the left, but now I'm going to take my right hip and turn it. And this is one of the biggest things that you'll see in Tour Pros nowadays. They have a massive amount of hip rotation. Now, many of you are going to say, well, I'm not flexible enough to get my hips that open. I get it. You're going to think that, but it's just because the way that you've been trying to get your hips open is why you haven't been able to do it, because I'm certain if you just stand here, you can get your hips very open. However, when you start firing this rocket in the wrong sequence, your hips won't have time to get open. And that's your biggest enemy in the golf swing, especially in the downswing, is time. The reason that most golfers struggle is they don't get the swing sequenced in the right space of time. There's only a quarter of a second to get everything that you're trying to do in the downswing. That's really, really fast. And if you're adding a lot of lateral movement because you have a wider stance and then trying to turn and then throwing your arms, your hips just won't have physical enough time to rotate out of the way. So what you have to do is you have to shift your focus to getting this right hip to come forward to help rotate the left hip out of the way. Now I can see I've made a huge turn here by driving this right hip forward. You need this when you're going to have the opportunity to add more right side in there, as I'm going to show you. So right hip has to come forward. As the right hip's coming forward, this initiates everything. Then my right shoulder can start to fire. And now you'll notice a pretty big difference in the position of my arm. My right arm is going to maintain a lot more flexion coming into impact, and this is the point where this last stage of the rocket can then fire to control the club face through the hitting area to create more of a time path for the club to be straighter through the hitting area. Now, in a lead side release, we're not trying to get the club to work more down the target. And again, the club's still working on an arc, so some of these things are going to be really exaggerated just to help you see it. In fact, I'm going to use some drills with some tape to help you see what I did to create this movement pattern to keep the club face very, very quiet through the hitting area and take advantage of some physics principles that we're going to talk about in some other videos. So right hip, right shoulder, they're all trying to outrun the club. If I stall out early with my hip turn and start to fire with my shoulders, what's going to happen? I'm going to start scooping and flipping. That's why your hip has to be out in front. Your right hip has to drive, your right shoulder has to drive to stay in front of the club, and then it releases at the very end. Now for those of you who are a little bit stronger and want to use some right side at this right arm at this point, you can. And I'm going to show you some tour pros that do, and I'm going to show you some pros who don't. And there's a variation, and typically there's not necessarily one wrong or right way in doing this, but one was going to require more rotation and less arm strength, and one's going to require more arm strength, arm and grip and hand strength, and less rotation. So depending on how your body feels, how much rotational ability you have, how much flexibility you have, and how your spine feels, this will dictate how much right arm release you have. Because as I come through, so I've got stage 1 of the rocket, right hip, stage 2, right shoulder. My shoulders are still coming in square. This is going to be exaggerated because I'm obviously going slow. So my shoulders will still be square at impact. But this is going to lead to more rotation and more side bend the more I keep this right elbow from releasing, this right arm from thrusting down the line. So if you're the type of person who has spine issues, back problems, things like that, you may want to add some more right arm a little bit earlier so that as you get, so right hip, right shoulder, and now I'm saying, well, I don't want to keep rotating and I don't want to get into a lot of side bend, so I'm going to let my right arm start to throw the club, drive it down the line. You can see the club's taking a very, and this wouldn't happen at speed, but this is how you would be drilling to get that club face control using the right hand to help out with this. So the club face is staying very square and it's not rotating over very quickly. In a lead arm release or lead side release, the club face has more inherent rotation. It's more natural for the club face to swing, rotate on this arc, and turn over more. So there's a little bit more inherent club face rotation through the hitting area, from my experience with it, versus what you can do with the right arm to help kind of drive and steer the club more down the line. And that's why it's been termed a push release. Again, I don't really like that term. It's more of, it's happening super fast. It's not this heavy push. It's more of a, throwing the club a little bit and kind of guiding it down that line with a little bit of right arm thrust there. But it should be more quick and light and fast because your body should be moving fast, not this hard, heavy push straight down to the ground. That's going to, again, lead to a very steep angle of attack, which is a no-no. So if you have the strength, adding a little right arm, you can add some speed with this right arm at this point now. To do that, though, again, your hip has to be out of the way and your shoulder has to be in front. Now, what happens if I don't do that? Well, let's say my hips are only, 20 degrees open and my shoulders are still pretty closed, and I add that right arm thrust, well, look what happens. The club face, it's either going to shove it way out to the right, which isn't going to work, or what's more likely going to happen is you're going to flip the face over with that right hand. That's why in a lead side dominated swing, you don't really want to add right side, right hand into it because it causes the club face to flip over too fast. When you use centrifugal force to release the club, it just gets straightened out automatically for you and releases automatically for you. I'm not trying to do anything, literally, just letting the club release at that point. But if I added right arm with that, my left arm is going to tuck in, my elbow is going to rotate in, and the face is going to shut down, and I'm timing a flip. That's a very difficult way to play high-level golf. So that's why when you're lead side dominant, you don't really add right side. You can do a little bit. Freddie Couples is an example. You know, he had really high hands, and he'd take that right arm and he'd really tuck that right elbow in and throw the club, but then he would let go with his right hand, right? Vijay Singh, Freddie, Phil Mickelson, another example of guys who make kind of longer languid swings and use a little trailing arm to help get the club started down and shallow down from the top, but then they release it, right? That's where that drill comes from. Yes, you can add a little right arm, but you don't want to be driving and sustaining that force through the hitting area because you're going to flip the face over. Instead, it's throwing it and letting it release. That's what rotary swing has used preferably if you're going to add a little right arm. Again, it's more of a swinging motion than a pushing, hitting motion. And so that works totally fine. You just have to be mindful of not doing it the way Freddie did because that really blew out his back, and I'll talk about that in another video. So, long story short here, right hip, right shoulder, right arm thrust. Now, if you're the type of person that doesn't really have very good arm strength, if you're a little bit lighter, smaller, a lot of women don't have the strength in their arms to really control the club face to the hitting area. How do you get that club face control? Because again, that was one of the requirements. I want to have you guys have absolute club face control to know where that ball is going every single time. Not that you're not going to make mistakes, but as you start taking advantage of some of the things, the benefits that the push release has to offer and being right side dominant has to offer, not having to relearn to use the other side of your body and your brain, then you slow down how much this club face is rotating. And I'm going to show you with John Rahm, who I think has a really phenomenal push release, and how little club face rotation he has through the hitting area, and give you some simple drills to start practicing this. You're going to see your club face control go through the roof, especially if you've had no clue how to really properly release the golf club and you've been struggling kind of mixing these components. Yeah, okay, you're using your body and left side to pull, but then you add a lot of right arm flip in there, right? And then you're like, gosh, that doesn't work. Well, those things are like oil and water. They're very difficult to blend together in a way that's going to lead to consistent success. So if you're on that other side of the scale, you don't have the physical strength to keep that club face going down that target line a little bit more with the right arm thrust. And again, it's not that the left arm is not doing anything. Of course, the left hand is still in control. That doesn't change. But the right arm starts to help out now and drive that down the line. Well, if you don't have that strength with the right arm, then what you do is you keep turning. So now as I keep driving this right shoulder through, the club face still has very little rotation on it, but this is, of course, increasing the amount of rotation in your body. You can't have your cake and eat it too when it comes to this stuff. You either add right arm thrust to help that club face get that control of that push release, or you keep rotating this right shoulder through the ball to keep that club face from flipping over. Or of course you go the other side and just take the right arm out completely. But I'm assuming you're watching this because your right arm is the devil and you're wanting to figure out how can I use this right side of my body to control that club face. So this is, again, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're going to control that club face, you don't have the strength to do it with the right arm, totally fine. You're just going to keep driving that right shoulder through a little bit more to help control the club face through the hitting area. So it's going to look a little bit more like that. And from down the line, or excuse me, from up the line, you'll see I'll use this Swing Catalyst logo as kind of my target. If I go left arm only, the club face still basically travels down the line, releases back around to the left. But now as I'm practicing right side, I'm exaggerating, driving that club keeping the face square. And then we're going to talk about, when we get into parametric acceleration, how this really works to control the spin loft on the club to start giving you really, really monster shots with good height and trajectory with really great compression on it. So practice keeping the shaft de-lofted, but driving the right arm, or driving the club through more with the right arm, and keeping that club face more square. Now, if I do that, and then it releases, right? Now again, these are all exaggerations, these are drills to help you start kind of getting a concept of how a lead side release versus a trail side release is very different. So now, let's say I don't have that strength to drive that club down, but I still want to have that good club face control and that stability through the hitting area. You add more rotation. And again, I'm going to hold it off for a second to show you the idea of the club staying very, very, very square as long as I can. But in reality, at speed, it's still turning over. But I'm using my right hand, right shoulder more so to do that. So that's the first piece that you want to practice and see how you can get control of that club face again and get the club staying very stable through the hitting area, because one of the biggest things that I think most right side dominant players will get from this is understanding what that club is doing. What that club face is doing through the hitting area is so important. So now what I want to do is I'm going to take an example of a tour pro. I'm going to take Jon Rahm because I love what he's doing, and it'll help get into some of the other deeper concepts of parametric acceleration and how to control the release and stabilize the club face and using the body to do this. So let's take a look at Jon Rahm's swing and just how amazingly simple his release through the hitting area is that's led him to be one of the best ball strikers in the world. Let's take a look at the swing of Jon Rahm now. Now, one of the things that you will see in him, he has a really excellent sequence for a push release. And as I show you a couple other players after Jon, you'll start to see how these things work together in ball players and golfers who are using a push release who have a really, really good simple mechanics swing. So the first thing we're going to look at is that first stage. And this is one of the things that the tour pros do so well and the amateurs struggle so mightily with. And that is getting that club to shallow out with hip motion. Now, in the case of a pusher, that's going to be right hip. So I want you to focus first on this right pocket on Jon, and then watch as he begins to drive that right hip forward. That's the primary motion after he sets into that left side. So if you look at his left foot here, pretty clear to see he's going to really get a lot of weight transferred onto that, sitting into that left side. And then that right hip is going to begin to rotate. And you can see his right glute even pop out here pretty quick on the right side here. Notice how he begins to turn and drive that right hip forward. That's getting that initial hip rotation to move the club and the arms. And as a result, on the down the line view, you can see that his hands and the butt of the club basically travel straight down and begin to slowly arc out toward the ball. The average golfer begins to fire their arms immediately, and that drives their hands out in this direction, and that's what creates tons and tons of problems in the swing. The trick to all of this when you're using a push release is to drive, after you shift weight over to the left side, drive that right hip forward and then the right shoulder. Now, if you're left side pulling, it's different. We've talked about how the club shallows out on the regular other videos on the site. So this is really just going to be focusing on the right side push side motion. So right hip, and then watch as once his right hip gets that initial motion going, watch his right shoulder then begin to drive down and through and forward toward the ball. This is critical for a push release because it allows that right arm to stay in reserve so that it releases very late. That is critical. So you'll see halfway down, Jon's right arm is still fully bent and it maintains that flexion very late in the swing. Then at this point, this is when the release happens. Now this is just milliseconds right before the strike, so there's not really a lot that you can consciously do to change a lot about what's going to happen in the golf swing at this point. So this has really been set up in motion by that right hip and right shoulder driving, and then the right arm begins to release. And you can see from face on, there's obviously some pretty serious right arm extension going on there, and that's what allows him to create this very shallow and very simple angle of attack with a very stable club face, which is what I want to focus on next. So let's take a look face on and watch as the club works down. Now, one thing you'll note is the ball's a little bit further back in John's stance. This is common for right side pushers who are using a right side push release, because remember, if you're lead arm only, if you take your right arm off the club, you'll probably notice if you've ever taken practice swings or hit balls that your bottom of your swing arc goes way forward. Then when you put the right arm on there, but it's not really doing a lot, then the ball position moves back a little bit. This is where we talk about that left ear. In John's case, it's quite a bit further back, and that's because he's using more right arm at this point in the release. And he may be trying to flight the ball down a little bit here, but in general, you'll see a ball position that's a little bit further back when you're using more right arm to release. But the big thing we want to talk about is how shallow the angle of attack is. And in most amateurs, especially if they have the ball back in the stance, they're digging a squirrel grave for a divot here, right? We don't see that in better ball strikers. They're very, very shallow. And in John's case, he does an unbelievably great job of having such a really wide, shallow bottom of his swing arc. Look, a foot past impact almost, if not, perhaps even more than that. It's close to a foot. And the club shaft is still close to vertical. The club face still pretty square. Obviously, it's released a little bit. If you look back at where it was at impact, you can see a little bit more of the face, but there's not a ton of rotation there. The push release is what allows for this to be very shallow, like a plane coming in for a landing, and maintain that shallow bottom of the arc for a long period of time. And that's my favorite thing about using the push release. As I was going through my testing and trying different things, this was one of the things that allowed me to get a lot more height on the ball, but still maintain a really low spin rate. So it's not like you're flipping your hands here. He's got the club shaft de-lofted, so he's controlling the spin loft of the face. But by doing this, having this very shallow bottom of the swing arc and very little club face rotation, it just becomes a lot easier once you master this movement pattern to have a really consistent ball flight. You're getting a consistent strike because you're not swinging down very steeply. So, most amateurs come down too steep and then they bottom out a little early or a little bit late. It's very hard to catch the ball cleanly in the center of the face without coming down too steep, getting a little bit of grass in between the face and the ball. Most pros, very, very shallow through the strike. And again, controlling the rotation of that face. When we look at it from down the line, you'll see that John, let me bring him back here. So we'll draw a line here roughly in line with his feet. That's about where his feet are aiming, give or take a little bit. Camera angles can skew all this, of course, but we'll just use that as a basic line. So you'll see the club is obviously still working on an arc and a push release. And even in the drill I was giving you, kind of showing how you're extending the right arm to get the club face going more toward the target with a square face to the hitting area, you'll see the club is still working around on an arc. It's still working back to the left, but it may feel like for you when you're adding a lot of right arm extension, which John is at in this case already at this point in the swing, a lot of right arm extension there, and he feels like he's probably driving the club straight toward the target. It obviously still has to work back left. So that drill I gave you is a feel, not a real. So long story short, when you're looking at implementing a push release to be able to utilize the right side of the body, you have to drive with that right hip forward first, then the right shoulder, and then you can use that right arm. But before that, the only way you're going to get this club to shallow out and work your hands to work more straight down during the initial shallowing phase is to not be doing much of anything with your right arm. And you still have to have that left arm in control. Otherwise, your hands are going immediately this way. They're going straight out toward the ball, and that doesn't work. That's going to give you a steep angle of attack. You're going to tend to swing over the top, especially the higher handicaps, and you're going to run into a very difficult time controlling the club face and path working together. Whereas if you focus first on planting that way on the left side, just like normal, and then driving that right hip and then that right shoulder so that the right arm stays back and it stays in this flexion state so that you can release it very late in the swing, then you have a tremendous amount of control over that club face through the hitting area. So that's the primary difference. Again, the left arm shifting to the left side, all of that stuff is pretty much the same. It's just that you're adding more rotation to keep your body rotation in front of your hands. It's kind of the way I think about it. You're trying to keep your right shoulder in front of your hands. Of course, it's not. But that's the feeling so that I don't get into the point of flipping it over. When I was switching over, obviously I'm a left side puller, releasing the club passively, letting centrifugal force and centripetal force release the club for me. If I do that and add right arm, it's a big old flip. You know, I can time it well and still play plus handicap golf, but that's not something that's ideal. We don't want to be kind of mixing those two things. So when you add right arm, you're not going to be trying to pull so hard and get the club working left. You'll see in the next couple of players that I show you that with the push release, the club doesn't work left as much. So you'll see the different release patterns as we look at these other players. Let's take a look at those now. Now let's take a look at a Korean LPGA player who is definitely not of the size or stature of Jon Rahm. She probably weighs less than Jon Rahm's golf bag. But she has a beautiful swing, and you can see so many of the Korean LPGA players coming out with the very similar mechanics who are doing things the same way, and it is a right side push swing that you are seeing. And let's take a look at how she is employing this push into her swing. So let's take a look first at this 3-stage rocket. She does this really, really well. Now her arms are a lot deeper than Jon's. She doesn't have nearly the upper body arm and shoulder strength of Jon Rahm or probably most any PGA Tour guy. So she's not going to rely on that arm strength quite as much. So she's going to use more rotation. So you watch as she starts down. Watch how aggressive this right hip drive is. And I really want you to burn this into your memory because the next player I'm going to show you is going to do this very different. So a lot of right side rotation there, right hip rotation. Notice the flexion in the right knee. She's driving that right knee forward, which is really driving the right hip forward. And her chest is still staying basically open. The right shoulder hasn't really changed much, but that's about to change. But notice too how her arms aren't firing back out toward the target. Her left arm is still smashed against her chest. She's trying to leave that until later in the swing. The hips are doing the initial heavy lifting. They're the solid rocket boosters of the space shuttle. And then the primary engine, the engine of the right shoulder is going to happen, and then the right arm. So watch as we get nearer to impact. She's still turning that right hip, driving it forward, but that's going to slow down, and watch the right shoulder then dive forward. This is critical to avoid releasing the last stage of the rocket, that right arm, too soon. So notice how she's still got a very significant angle in that right arm. That's because that right shoulder has protracted and begun to outrun the hands. The right shoulder is trying to move in front, and that allows her to keep that right arm later into the release, that right arm flexion, which is critical for a push release. That's what it is. It's extending that right arm at the tricep quickly through the hitting area. Now you'll see she doesn't have the strength of Jon, so she releases a little bit later, but she still has a very aggressive release through that strike with that right arm, and you'll see the hips are now done. They're just posting up. The right shoulder can't really move, so it's all just that right arm releasing the club, and she gets into a beautiful follow through, and this is all just these 3 basic moves: right hip, right shoulder, right arm pushing. And you'll see the club doesn't work very aggressively left. In fact, it's working almost out to the right, and her hands are actually kind of almost going more, if you drew a line kind of down the target line, a lot of times you'll see golfers whose club works and their hands work very hard left. In a push release, you're a lot less likely to see that because the right arm is releasing very late. Now let's take a look at another tour pro who's doing the same movements but in a slightly different sequence. Okay, so now we've got Brooke Henderson, and this brings us back to full circle about the research that I originally started doing about the elevation of the arms, and does it matter in how they're released, and the performance of power, and how you're able to use ground force and all those things. And what you're going to see in Brooke's case is she's actually going to have very high hands. You'll see the club kind of working pretty severely to the outside there, going pretty much straight up, and her hands are now much higher, and she's got a little bit more of a higher flying right elbow. It's a lot of elevation, right? Her elbow is now basically the center of her chest. Obviously didn't start there. It started down here by her belt buckle. So that's what we would call arm elevation. Now, the catch is that she's got to get rid of this arm elevation because you kick the golf ball from there. The ball's down on the ground. So what does she do? And this is what's interesting about her swing. She's going to use a lot of the same, but it's going to be in a slightly different sequence because of the amount of elevation she put in her swing. It's not that you can't play great golf with a lot of elevation and still use a right side push release, which she does. But you're going to watch that she's going to have a big, significant left arm loop here. This is left arm driven and body driven. The right arm cannot really create. It can help a little bit. That's where talking about changing the pitch of the shaft a little bit, but this is primarily lead arm that's doing this. If the right tricep activated, you would just see this angle completely widen. That's all it can do. If the right tricep starts to fire, her right arm would begin to get much wider, but you can see that's clearly not what's happened. In fact, her hands have actually taken a pretty complicated route like this. Let's get out of here. Her hands have basically done this. They've gone away from the target and then back down. Now, as a result of this big shallowing move that she's had to put in because she put in all this extra elevation into her swing, which again is totally fine, you just have to shallow it back out. Watch how much her hands move during this phase of the swing and how little her right hip is moving in comparison to the other golfers that I've shown you. You'll notice that the Korean LPGA gal, she fired her right hip immediately and she didn't have this big elevation. So she didn't have to go through this big shallowing sequence in order to get that left arm down and keeping the right arm back. So one of the things you'll notice is that as she's doing this, as the right hip begins to fire, her right shoulder begins to fire a little bit sooner. Notice this, the wrinkles popping up in her shirt there, but by her right shoulder. This is right shoulder protraction, just rolling that right shoulder forward, getting ready to drive hard with that right shoulder through the ball. And you'll see that keeps the right arm in flexion so that as she continues to drive with that right shoulder, she has something left to hit with, which is this angle right here, which again is the prototypical push-release position. Her hips have still gotten very open at this point, but she was not as aggressive with her hips as the Korean LPGA player. She was more aggressive with her right shoulder once she got that shallowing move done. And then as she comes through, now she's got you can watch the right arm. It's pretty obvious. There's a lot of right arm extension happening right there. Look at the angle right before impact. This is milliseconds before impact. You couldn't possibly do anything to change the outcome of your swing at this point, and she's just extending that right arm. So that's what she's been setting up for, and you'll see the rotation in her hips is done. It's just posting up, bracing here, and right arm extension for the push release. And again, if you watch the club face, look at how quiet the rotation of the face is all the way through the hitting area. It's very, very quiet. You see a very shallow angle of attack and a big aggressive right arm release through the hitting area. She did it more right shoulder a little earlier, not as aggressive as a right hip, but either way, she got that right shoulder coming forward to keep the right elbow back. If you don't drive that right shoulder forward in a push release, you just have a flip. And that's what a lot of golfers will do because they start firing the arm too soon. That's the third stage of the rocket. She's waiting to the very end, and that's why she has this big rerouting move. She knows she doesn't need to do anything with her arms at that point other than get them shallowed back out. And then the right shoulder rotating, driving forward to get that right arm in a position where it can get into the push release is the key to moving the club in this way. So right side dominant peeps, you need right hip, right shoulder, and then at the very, very end, that right arm release can help push the club through the hitting area and keep the club face very stable so that you can start having complete control over the club face helping out more so with your dominant hand, your right hand. For those of you who, the basic pulling motion and swinging motion is just something that you struggle with, this move, now, while it may look pretty aggressive with this big aggressive push release, if I play it back, relatively fast, it still looks like a normal golf swing, even though there's what a lot of people would call a hit in there with that right arm. When you look at this at speed, it looks much like a golf swing. Maybe it doesn't have the beautiful elegance of some other swings that you may have seen on the tour, but the results are the same. You can get there either way.